Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to begin our conversation about pricing and profit. So here we are on our journey in disciplined entrepreneurship. We've covered a variety of topics all the way through understanding aspects of customers, markets, and even the business model. And now we won't need to think about understanding pricing choices and the implications those have for the organization. So you might say to yourself, what does price mean in the first place? Traditionally, we have a very simplistic perspective on price because our primary role, especially as students, is to be a consumer. We go to Amazon, we go to a grocery store, and the price is right there on the product or the service, and we simply either decide to pay it or not. It's useful to be a little more specific about what we mean by price. So here's the quick definition in which we reference the amount of money that a seller is willing to accept in exchange for a product or a service at a specific time and under specific circumstances. We're trying to be very quantitative about this and recognize that it changes with context. One of the real interesting aspects of being an entrepreneur, of course, is the realization that especially at the beginning, you often get to choose the price. And it's one of the most important choices that an entrepreneur makes when launching a venture. Price is information. That's a much more useful way to think about it than simply the amount of money that you pay to get something. Price allocates goods and services among those who are willing and able to buy them. It's a discriminatory system. That is, some people can afford it, some people cannot afford it, and some people make choices about whether to purchase or not, even if they absolutely can't afford it. It allocates financial resources among producers according to how well they satisfy customer needs. That is, organizations that better satisfy customer needs usually can charge higher prices. It helps customers allocate their own financial resources among various wants. So, for example, customers look at prices and think, I only have enough money to buy 2 out of these 3 goods. Which 2 should I purchase? Price provides competitors with information about potential profitability. You can look at what your customers are charging and think, can I also provide this product or service and still make money? And importantly, it can be perceived as a signal of quality. Something that has a higher price tag on it creates a psychological impact with customers, suggesting that it's higher quality. Why does price matter? Well, obviously at the simplest level, price determines how many units you sell and whether you make a profit or not. This is incredibly important to recognize because many entrepreneurs start their journey thinking that their goal is to sell at the lowest possible price. And in my personal opinion, that is an absolutely terrible way to think about pricing your product. Your goal as an entrepreneur, all else being equal, is to sell for the highest price that you possibly can. You may choose to sell at a lower price for a variety of reasons. Perhaps you don't want to make profit. Perhaps you're hoping that you can sell more if you sell at a lower price, you'll generate more volume. But ultimately, if you know that your customers are willing to pay more, then your baseline assumption should be to charge them more. In order to think about whether or not a idea is going to succeed, we use a fairly simple calculation and framework called break-even analysis. And so we want to start with that because if your business or your product doesn't have a break-even point, then you probably don't have a viable business in the first place. So we're going to talk about that first, and then in the second part of the presentation, we're going to talk about pricing methods and strategies. So here is what break-even analysis actually means. You're not required for your exam to be able to recapitulate this particular chart, but it is a pretty clear example of what's going on. For a given number of units sold, and whatever your price is, you can figure out your total sales, and that will tell you whether or not you are generating a loss or whether you're generating a profit. So you have a total revenue curve and a total cost curve, and where they intersect is your break-even point. This chart has various assumptions associated with it, which we could talk about. There's an assumption about your fixed costs. That is, the costs to run your business no matter what you do, and your variable costs, which is how much you pay for every unit that you sell. And it's important to recognize the difference between those two. Your textbooks talks about them, and the resources on Canvas can help you understand those a little bit better. We're going to go through a very simple example, and that's the kind of example that you would need to be able to do for either on a quiz or in an exam. So let's walk through this to make sure that we're all clear on what's going on. Here's just the terminology to make sure, in case you're not familiar with this, just walks you through the definitions for each of these, each of the terms that we're going to use in this analysis. Break even in words simply means how many do you have to sell to cover all your costs to avoid losing money, right? So our straight up definition is it's the number of units that must be sold such that your total revenue is equal to your total cost. And here's the equation for it, which you may want to memorize. It's useful to know the context of the examples that we'll be going through are simple enough that you probably could figure it out without memorizing the equation, but I know for some people that makes it a little bit easier. Your break-even point, that is the number of units you need to break even, is your total fixed costs divided by your price per unit minus your variable cost per unit. Your break-even point in terms of sales is then your break-even point, which is the number of units that you sell times how much you're charging. So let's do a really simple example. We've decided to open a little hot dog stand here. We have our cart. We're going to have hot dogs and buns, and we're going to wander around campus selling them. There is a fixed cost associated with this. We have to rent the cart. It's not ours. We rent it, and it costs us $80 a day to rent it. It does not matter how many hot dogs we sell, whether we sell no hot dogs or 1 million hot dogs. Our fixed cost is the same, $80 per day. However, we have to pay for our supplies. And in this case, actually, because this is Wisconsin, we will be selling brats, of course. And we pay, in this example, $6 for each brat and bun. But our price is $10 for each brat and bun. And so we have all of the information that we need in order to complete a break-even analysis. Our fixed cost, our variable cost, and our price per unit. So please take a moment and see if you can figure out how many brats we need to sell in order to break even. I strongly encourage you to simply pause this recording right here and see if you can figure this out before we move on. I know that your instinct is to simply let it go so you can see the answer, which I will show you, but take a moment and see if you can figure it out. It shouldn't be that complicated. Let's see how you did. Our equation is our number of units is our total fixed cost divided by our price per unit minus our variable cost per unit. Well, our price per unit minus variable cost per unit is 10 minus 6, which is $4, and our fixed cost is $80. So 80 divided by 4 is 20. In other words, we need to sell 20 brats in order to break even. If this was your guess, well done. If it wasn't your guess, maybe take a moment here to kind of make sure you see how to do this. But we can also double check this. Our total revenue is $10, that's how much we're charging per brat, times 20. That was what we said our break-even analysis is. And so that gives us $200 of total revenue. But let's check our total costs. We have $80 in fixed costs. That's how much it costs to rent the cart every day. And then we have $6. That's how much we pay per brat times the 20 brats that we bought. That's $120. 80 plus 120 is 200. And so you can see very specifically the break-even results right there. We had $200 of revenue and $200 of costs. And the point is that the next brat that we sell is where we begin to make a profit, because we don't have to cover our fixed costs anymore. And our next brat will be able to, we charge $10 for, and it only costs us $6. And so our next brat generates $4 in profit. The calculation for break-even analysis is pretty easy. The challenge is usually determining the right numbers to use because most businesses are not quite as simple as our hot dog cart. You have to think carefully about which expenses are fixed, such as office expenses or salaries, and which are variable, such as supplies or things like electricity used in manufacturing. And what's the right amount to measure? This concept of break-even analysis is incredibly important for entrepreneurs to think carefully about because you could go through this process to see, given my various costs, how many do I have to sell in order to actually make a profit? And this can also be used for marketing promotional items, right? So for example, if you are already running your hot dog cart and you decide to spend more money on an advertising campaign, you can carefully think about how many more units you have to sell in order to justify the advertising costs, which effectively become a fixed cost. Traditional pricing objectives usually try to accomplish one of a couple of different things. We might just be trying to maximize our profits. We might, however, be just trying to survive. We may be pricing products in order to establish or maintain the firm in a market. That could be the case during a downturn or during a competitive war. But it's a dangerous long-term perspective to have, that you're pricing based on survival. You might have a target return on investment, especially if, for example, you have specific investors that you need to satisfy their return expectations, or you're trying to justify R&D expenditures. You might have a specific market share goal. You might be under the impression that you need to maintain something like 20% of market share in order to be successful in the long haul. Or you could use what's called status quo pricing. That is, you're pricing your product so as not to change the stability of prices in the industry. Many entrepreneurs think that the best way to enter an industry is to price below competition, but it's important to remember that when you do that, very often the competition will also lower its prices. This can create a race to the bottom in which organizations continuously lower their prices and lower their profitability. If you're new to an industry and you're fighting against entrenched competitors, and you come in and start a pricing war, the odds are good that they can last longer than you can because they'll have access to capital that you probably do not. For startups, pricing likely depends on the nature of the product. If you've got a product that's pretty much or pretty similar to something that's already out there, then probably pricing's pretty well known, and you're likely to have to price compared to how competitors price. Your costs are probably not certain, but they're not totally unknown either, and you can probably get a pretty good idea of what your cost structure is going to look like by figuring out how your competitors actually function. Your value proposition is important in establishing your price, recognizing what's different about your product than your competitors, but you can't go too far away from the way that products are priced currently. But if you're bringing a completely novel product to market, price discovery is probably an important priority for the startup team. What price can we charge customers who've never seen anything like this before? And your costs are likely to be almost totally unknown or very much unknown because you don't know how hard it's going to be to bring products to customers or how long it's going to take them to actually make the purchase decisions. And so you have to build a business model so the company can be profitable in relation to whatever competitors either exist or when competitors actually do show up. And it's important to recognize that competitors will show up eventually. It's always a mistake to think that you'll operate without competition either initially or in the long run. So hopefully this gives you a good sense of the importance of starting your break-even analysis and beginning to think about pricing. And then we're going to follow up with more ideas on pricing methods and strategies.